Hello there. We're back from Colombia, and I just wanted to tune in with you again as a follow-up to kind of an amazing trip. What I'd like to focus on with you here is the extent of unrest and disparity that we witnessed while we were down in South America. We're talking about the country of Colombia, which is really named after Christopher Columbus and the colonization of Europe in the Americas. So, well, I guess we're all learning how our presence as European descendants exists, and that experience of how we've offset another group of people who were already living on the land here before we arrived. And so here we are today, the product of all this influx of European influence. I've got to tell you that I'm disgusted with the way that capitalistic profiteering goals are supported by governments that essentially take people's lives and their land away from them. So we went down to Colombia and we looked at a historical capital called Santa Fe, interestingly, which was a Spanish style colonial development. And, Catholicism is really interwoven richly into these cultures. And I think, just what I believe I witnessed was there's a slight difference between the way that other countries like Spain, in this example, infiltrated in northern South America, and they actually intermeshed with the natives. After they took all their gold and basically made them all Spanish. And so there's such a small percentage of people who live that are indigenous and purely indigenous to the region, which we know about in the Sierra Nevada of Santa Marta in the north coast. But we were down in the area of Pablo Escobar's reign. And if you know anything about Pablo Escobar, he was a huge drug lord, but a highly celebrated man because Colombia's government is centralized, meaning they don't have any states within the country. It's all just one governing body. And if the president lives in Bogota, which is, the capital, there's very little interest in all of the little regions and the farmers and perhaps even the middle class, for that matter. Pablo educated children and in the small villages and realized that there was a big financial gain that he could accumulate through the sale of cocaine. And there were drug wars between the government and Pablo Escobar's force. As they gained money, they had more weapons, and people were fleeing from the countryside into the urban areas. And we went to the city of Medellin, which is the second largest city in Colombia, with 9.5 million people. And during the 80s and 90s, when Escobar had his reign, and there was so much violence during this time, the middle class actually hired a paramilitary force just to protect themselves against the government and the FARC, which is the drug lords, and this huge era of violence where no one was safe. If you had ties with one group or another, you had to basically take sides to protect yourself, and hopefully you were on the right side. Now, in Medellin, this beautiful, amazing city in the landscape of Colombia, which is like the foothills of the Andes. It's such steep green, wonderful hillsides that are just so beautiful. And Medellin sits right in this valley, and it just takes up the whole valley floor. And as people moved in from the rural areas because of violence, they would build on the hillsides, and then slowly the hillsides were occupied by all these new residents. And so the the richer areas, the ritzy, more urban area exists down in the bottom, and then these social classes slowly start to fill in, and you go from a wealthy class and less and more impoverished, until basically these people are moving up onto the crests of these hillsides. And all of these neighborhoods are so fragmented, and they had their own trouble with violence. And there was just a total disconnect. And there's a lot going on. And when Pablo Escobar was assassinated in the 90s, after 10 years of a really solid reign, when cocaine was on the rise in the United States, I mean, that's directly the audience and the consumer of this product that was being grown in the countryside in Colombia by these farmers that were associated with the FARC. But if you didn't want to be involved with that, you had to flee for your life. And you would go to the cities. And there was a man who was elected mayor in Medellin, and he had 3 years to connect all of the barrios, all of the neighborhoods in this giant city, 9 to 10 million people. And they installed infrastructure like a metro rail system and even metro cables that go up the mountainsides, so that all of these neighborhoods could be connected and more urbanized. And it actually was a lifeline of health for these people that were fleeing to the cities. And it opened up these corridors of commerce, and people had businesses and lives now, and they were all connected to each other. And that's what we witness today. And the spirit of the people is so positive that there's like this renewal. And it's been less than 20 years, maybe only 10 or 15 years since these upgrades have happened. And there's hope there. There's really hope. And so I'm sharing this story with you because after leaving the city and viewing all this change that happened quickly, I mean, we need hope in our politics that we can change rapidly for the benefit of people. Okay, so we were in Medellin, and then we transitioned to this really beautiful eco reserve, La Reserva, which is like a jungle. I mean, there were snakes and scorpions and huge broadleaf plants and all these different canopy layers of ecosystem diversity. And Rio Claro, which is the clear, pure river that runs right through this reserve, which is a privately owned reserve. We met the young man whose family that owns the reserve, and he's a really intellectual guy. He was part of the presentations, and he was one of our tour guides. He shared with us, the beauty and just the nice way that they have sustained this precious little environment of biodiversity. Many birds, iguanas, all different types of fish. And one day he took us on a little field trip. There is a huge cement plant that is extracting the limestone and the marble from this geologic area for commercial interest. And they've already broken many laws that regulate that their processing needs to be a certain distance from the river. And so we were at this isolated little reserve, and we took a tour to go see this gigantic cement plant. And it's on the scale of being one of the largest in South America. And it's within 1 kilometer of the reserve. But the plant itself, it spans, I mean, it's like factory after pipes and tubes and mechanics and all this machinery and people. We had to get permission to drive on a public road that was blocked. It was gated by this cement company, because they didn't want people to come through. And the problem here, the span of this whole factory setup was at least a kilometer in distance, and maybe in diameter of the perimeter of this operation. And so we were told that this operation has the Dow Jones sustainability approval, which means that people on Wall Street can invest in this operation because it's sustainable. And it was clearly an environmental tragedy to this fragile ecosystem. I mean, maybe a very small percent, within 5% of Colombia's natural wildlands are still pristine and intact. And so I witnessed this raping, exploitive pattern. And they celebrate it there, the locals, like it's an economy and people now have jobs. And in this little trucking village, because the only traffic that we saw really on the highways were either buses full of people, trucks full of some kind of natural resource that they had extracted from the land, taxis and motorcycles. So if you were independent, you drive a motorcycle. And we were taken through the gates and we saw the entire operation of this cement plant. And we had to, ask them to open the gate so we could pass on the road, the only dirt road that connects two villages that were completely isolated and cut off by this corporate operation. And we looked at plantations filled with teak trees that the cement plant, they own many, it's like hundreds of thousands of acres or hectares. And they planted all these teak forests as an investment for the future when the limestone and the marble extraction is finished, done, taken, all of it taken. And then they'll have these older grown trees that they can then harvest for wood and sell that as well. And I believe this is how they're able to be stamped with the sustainability approval, because they have offset some of their carbon emissions, or somehow, planting these trees makes them like a green business. But we don't really see this stuff in the United States. We're not really aware of the lifestyle that people live in other countries. And I saw a lot of poverty. The American dollar is, whatever we could buy in the United States, you could get 3 times your value in Colombia. And, tourism might be the healthiest injection of economy, of money into the area, because you're not exploiting the land, at least, and people can make a decent wage running an eco hostel, in the reserve. But if you want to invest money somewhere in some land, buying up these properties near the reserve and making sure they will never go to these huge companies that Wall Street is investing in is a good bet. Environmentally, we're talking about the equator and this band around the globe. We have the poles, but the equator is really, Katrina and I were talking about how it's the lungs and even the Sierra Nevada is like the heart of the world. And if we deforest it all to plant teak trees and to extract precious resources, we're destroying our home. That's as frank as I can say it. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what we learned from this trip. There seems to be two types of people in the world, and there are unconscious, self-interested people that just want an instant grab. And it might be a lot of money or a lot of value or, yeah, you know how you trade stocks on the market and you just buy them and sell them like that. And all of a sudden, you got a big number in your bank account. Well, this is a pretty recent phenomenon on Earth relative, to human existence. But they're not just numbers in a bank account. There's a real effect that's happening by supporting one agency or another. And, these corporate interests are backed by government in the colonial settlement model. But what about the others? What about the others? the people. I mean, there's obviously more than two types of people in the world, but I'm trying to narrow this down in a way that we can really digest something here and hopefully take something away from it, because there are people in the world who are just trying to make it. And if a big cement plant shows up in your backyard and all of a sudden wants to start paying your community to be employed by their efforts, money goes somewhere. It has power, even if the employees are underpaid. But the irony about people that had no money at one point and then receive new money, in a country like Colombia, there's also a lot of cheap stuff that is probably manufactured in China, and it's plastic and it's bad for the environment and it's just a cheap thrill. And so in these little trucking villages where they were hiring truckers to haul materials across really four-wheel drive roads, I mean, these people probably work hard and get paid a small amount. They come home and they get to eat, they get to, have a roof over their head, and then they buy a cheap stuffed animal for their daughter or something that brings them, a moment of joy. And that's a beautiful thing. I don't want to diminish that providership, because I think that's celebrated worldwide, but the experience is cheap because we're selling out the environment and our home. And water is a precious resource and it's being contaminated. So if you can't survive, then what good is a little stuffed animal that you just spent your paycheck to try to surprise your family with? I think you get the idea. We need to focus on human life and a quality of life for everyone where we get to thrive. And it might mean a compromise for our Western modernism, the way that we just get in our car and start it right up and head to work. And let's look at our values and if meanwhile we're enjoying this luxurious lifestyle and then other people's environments are suffering, we need to make some change. And that's why I'm filming this video, is because there is a type of person that realizes what's going on in the world, and they wake up and then they say, hey, we need to do this right. I mean, and I'm not talking about Tyler's version of what's right and what's wrong, but let's bring these issues to light and then ask, is settlement style of colonialism still good for everyone? Because I think people are being exploited and lands are being trashed, and something needs to change, and we can do it in a conscious way. Something needs to change. Let's make a change. So whether we like it or not, we are one global family. Humanity. We are one species. We're all in this together, and there's a need to really genuinely care for each other, not just the numbers in our bank accounts and how big that can get. We need to redistribute all this wealth. And if we're going to do some damage to an area, let's change our methods or make it in a way that really is officially sustainable, like authentically Like when you ask a human being, can we still drink this water? And you can give them the honest answer, yes. And it's going to be good for you. We are one global family. We're all in this together. This is one home for everyone, and we can't lie to each other anymore. And we need to change this model of, or create a new thing instead of colonialism. Maybe like unity, where we care about everyone's needs, where people's lives matter and important resources matter. Water is so precious. We must have pure water in order to live, and life is a basic right, and we can thrive. I believe we can thrive. I see a vision, a beautiful vision of it. Es muy importante hablar en muchos idiomas. We need to be able to speak many languages.